Lost Treasures of the Ancient World, Samurai Japan is a documentary film about great ancient monuments in Japan, religious influence in Japanese history, and the samurai warriors and their moral code of Bushido. With director Chris Gormley and writer David Manson, this documentary was released in the year 2000 and has a runtime of about 50 minutes. So, is it a good documentary? What makes it successful or unsuccessful? Here are my opinions. Let's start on a positive note and list out my pros. I like how this documentary has computer animation graphics for the buildings that it discusses. I think it's more visually comprehensive than just showing footage or images of the buildings that they're discussing. While I think the animations aren't perfect, they're not bad, especially by 2000 standards. This documentary also used a timeline and paintings as visual aid to the topics discussed, which is another aspect that I enjoyed. Information-wise, I believe this documentary was well researched. While I'm not the most knowledgeable person on Japanese history, I do believe that the information in the documentary is accurate, and that they're not spreading misinformation or heavily biased information in this documentary. The information presented in the documentary is pretty much the same as what you would find when you are Googling samurai history. Lastly, I enjoyed the close-up shots included of samurai weapons. Visually, that was definitely my favorite part of the documentary, and seeing actual samurai tools on screen added to my overall interest in the history. Now let's discuss the cons. To start, I'm going to say that it's pretty obvious from watching this documentary that it is not very high budget. The graphics seem inexpensive, the soundtrack is really generic, and the same images are reused throughout the film. Something specific I noticed was the repeated use of the same B-roll footage. I think this speaks to how low budget the film is, because B-roll doesn't really need to communicate anything, it's just background imagery, and they couldn't even shoot enough of it to fill up the entire documentary. This reuse of footage also contributes to the documentary being repetitive. Much of the documentary is formulaic and follows the pattern of showing the timeline, showing an ancient painting, then showing B-roll while a professional does a voiceover explaining the history. This overall just makes the documentary a lot more boring. They could have spiced it up a bit by having multiple different historians discussing the history, maybe getting some different opinions, conflicting beliefs, or just showing a wider variety of B-roll footage or ancient artworks. After all, the documentary is discussing infamous warriors, so I feel like this documentary shouldn't be as boring as it is when the subject matter is so interesting. So that's what I think the documentary does well and doesn't do well, but that's just one opinion. Let's see what other people have to say about this documentary. Upon researching this film, it was actually quite difficult for me to find people discussing it online. I think that its lack of notoriety really speaks to the film's quality. I was, however, able to find this film on IMDb, where it has a whopping 13 ratings and 1 review. The overall consensus was that this film scored 7.7 out of 10 stars, which personally I think is a bit high, but it's not out of the ballpark. IMDb user Sepabo Yakazabe said in his review, "This documentary isn't what it said it is, because it's not about ancient Japan, but about Japan from creation to World War II. However, the history is clearly told, illustrated with a lot of pictures and animation." This is a great point that I hadn't considered. Even if the information discussed in the documentary seems to be accurate? Is it discussing what the title implies it discusses? While digging, I was also able to find this documentary sold as a DVD on Amazon, where it has 6 ratings, all with reviews. The average rating is 3.6 out of 5 stars, which is a rating I agree with for the film. Amazon reviewer Ronnie had to say, the experts used in this documentary made a thoroughly interesting subject so much less so. Couldn't have said it better myself, Ronnie. A different review by user Saruguma said, this is an interesting documentary for enthusiasts of Japan and provides a sufficient history in just over 50 minutes. This is another statement that I can get behind. While the film itself may not be great, the history is certainly there. So, in conclusion, I learned that history isn't the only aspect to a good documentary. While this film discussed most of what it sought out to discuss, its low budget and uninteresting historians lowered my overall rating of the film. The addition of visual aid in the film makes it bearable to watch, and it does follow normal genre conventions of a documentary. Yet, it is still far from perfect, and could have been much better with a little extra money and a little extra creative direction. I'd probably rate this film at a 7 out of 10 because I believe it deserves a passing grade at least. That being said, I don't see myself ever recommending this documentary to anyone I know.